Greetings from Madison, Wisconsin. My name is Dan Hummel, and I am guest lecturing for Dr. Cootsona as you're talking about the end of the world, and particularly Paul Boyer's book, When Time Shall Be No More. Uh, just a brief background about me. I got my PhD in American history from the University of Wisconsin a few years ago. And a fun fact that puts me in the conversation with Paul Boyer is that my advisor was the replacement for Paul Boyer when he retired about 10 years ago. And so, in a way, I see myself as Boyer's intellectual grandchild. I studied American religious and intellectual history, particularly in the 20th century. And my first book here, the cover you see on the screen, is about evangelical Christians and Jews, particularly American Jews and Israeli Jews, and the roles that the relationship between those two communities have uh, in relation to U.S.-Israel diplomacy. That book came out last year. And I'll just mention that Boyer's book was sort of one of the first books I read about. So before jumping into the book and our discussion, I wanted to give a little more background on Paul Boyer, since I'm pretty familiar with his work and here at UW-Madison, where he worked for so long. You can see a picture here of Boyer on the left side, earlier, sort of later in his career, and of course the cover of your book. Boyer was born into a conservative Christian home, but it wasn't maybe the stereotypical conservative Christian home. He was born into a Brethren in Christ church in Ohio, and really lived separate from most of the rest of society growing up. The Brethren Church is sort of an offshoot of the Mennonites, if you know anything about the Mennonites. And this is really where Boyer, where at least his religious biography is rooted in. But also his lifelong interest in religion stems from this upbringing. Now he left that tradition later in life, but it really fueled his interest in the intersection of religion and culture and politics and ideas as well. And you can see that through Boyer's long-running scholarship. He published over a dozen books, starting with a really transformative book in the 70s on the Salem witch trials. He wrote a lot about the progressive era reform movements, the temperance movement, and the movements by particularly many Christian progressives in the early 20th century to address issues of urbanization. And then he turned his attention later in his career to post-1945 America. He had a very well-received book about the American reception to the atomic bomb called By the Bomb's Early Light. And then, of course, the book that we're talking about now, When Time Shall Be No More. And now, finally, before jumping into our discussion, I did want to give a little more background about the time, the period of time when Time Shall Be No More was published. Give you a sense of what was going on both in the field of history and in society more generally, that sort of makes sense of why this book came out when it did and why it looks the way it did. And so the first thing to mention is that Paul Boyer was part of something called the cultural turn in intellectual history or in American history in the 80s and 90s. And this was using the techniques, the cultural turn means a lot of things, but in the particular sense I'm using it here. It means that Boyer, who was trained as an intellectual historian, used the methods that historians use to look at intellectuals, philosophers and theologians and other people who write for a living, and use those methods to look at what we might call more popular or if you want to be judgmental about lowbrow forms of writing, including prophecy tracts. And so if you can imagine how you would try to read and understand an intellectual's corpus of writings, someone like Jane Addams or Ralph Waldo Emerson or some sort of great thinker in American history. And you use those same techniques where you're closely reading the text. You're trying to understand who the writer is responding to when they're writing their stuff. What's the network of thinkers that are feeding into a certain idea? Boyer's using those same techniques to look at prophecy tracks and really, pulling out a lot of interesting themes and a lot of interesting ideas while doing that. So that is what I mean by the cultural turn. It was pretty innovative at the time, and it's still something that many historians do. Secondly, another sort of piece of context is the political situation in the U.S. and in Israel during the 80s and 90s when Boyer was researching and then finally publishing this book. And just briefly, in the late 70s, in the U.S. politics, there emerged what was called by journalists and then by scholars the Christian right or the religious right, a group of resurgent, mostly evangelical Christians, politically resurgent, who were organizing in a much more substantive way to get their political views heard and voted into office. And that included many evangelicals who cited prophecy just sort of haphazardly or without much thought. People like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. You think of like the televangelists in the 80s. All these people, for many Americans, particularly if they weren't part of that subculture, were new, and there was a lot of interest in understanding the role of prophecy belief in what those people were saying about politics and about society. And so Boyer is writing into that sort of question mark by many Americans. And at the same time, in Israel, which is obviously a key sort of symbol, at least, for prophecy belief, Israel had witnessed its own resurgence or original surge of right-wing or conservative politics. In 1977, the Conservative Party won its first election in Israel ever and brought to office the Likud Party, which is the party that is in office now as well. They haven't been in office the whole time, but they've sort of dominated Israeli politics since the 70s. And with the Likud Party came a renewed Israeli interest in promoting Christian support for Israel, particularly in America, because the U.S.-Israeli relationship was so important to Israel. And so Boyer is also writing in a context where the public relationship between American evangelicals and Israeli leaders is getting new attention. And finally, one more topic just to touch on before jumping into the book. Boyer wrote When Time Shall Be No More before some of the key evidence of the importance of prophecy belief actually emerged. And that includes in 1995 the release of Left Behind, which was the first in a massive series of novels about the end of the earth and the return of Jesus. You can see here the image has the claim that over 55 million were sold in the series. The main series is 12 books, and then there's a ton of spin-off books. That number is way over 80 million at this point. And has turned a lot of the success of Left Behind has turned a lot of attention by scholars to prophecy belief in modern American culture, and Boyer's book has become sort of a classic because he more or less anticipated the popularity of Left Behind that came out just after his book came out. And finally, on the right, I have the symbol there for Christians Unite for Israel, which is the first fully national organization that is basically a lobby group for Christians who support Israel. And Christians Unite for Israel was founded in 2006, and it now, as of this year, claims over 8 million members in the U.S. And so what was a growing public awareness of the support that Christians had for Israel in the 80s and 90s has turned into a full-fledged political relationship, but with lobby groups and all that. And Christians United for Israel has been very involved during the Trump years in promoting pro-Israel politics and policy in the U.S. as well. And so both of these phenomena, the pop culture one and the sort of political, are things that Boyer sort of maybe could have predicted, but he was writing before them, and that makes his book all the more notable and all the more citable and referable and a continuing reference source for historians and others today. So jumping into the topic of Jews and the end times from the perspective of Christian prophecy belief, I think it's important to start with some key terms that lay out some of the long history that Boyer also talks about. I want to just plug the book you see on the screen, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, by David Nirenberg. It's a few years old now. I think it's from 2015, 2016. And David Nirenberg is a Jewish historian, a historian of Judaism as well, and someone who has written for a long time now about Jewish-Christian relations. And this is his 3,000 years spanning history of anti-Judaism. And I want to unpack a little what anti-Judaism is and isn't in relation to Jewish-Christian relations. So you see here a few key terms. As you might have gleaned from Boyer's book, Jewish-Christian relations are fundamental to Christian history, and they start in the first century with the first Christians who come out of Jewish backgrounds. And the level of tension is high even at the beginning, but takes on a totally new dimension by the 4th century when the Roman Empire turns Christian, and the power dynamics between Christians and Jews changes. So up until that time, both Christians and Jews were subcultures, religious cultures in the broader Roman Empire, which was pagan. And that changes in the 4th century with the rise of Constantine and the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And so really the tense relationships take on new dimensions when now Christians control vast amounts of wealth and resources, and their population is much, much larger than the Jewish population. And when we talk about the troubled relationship between Jews and Christians, we're often thinking of the 1500 years since the Christianization of the Roman Empire and the Christianization of Europe. You can think of some of the major episodes in the poor treatment of Jews by Christians, including the Crusades, the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, the pogroms in Eastern Europe, many of these couched in terms of Christian theology. But to get more specific on that, this term supersessionism, which really wasn't a common term until the 20th century, but it's been used now to describe a broader Christian theological argument. The idea here, if you think of superseding, something supersedes something else, we might talk about the iPhone 10 superseding the iPhone 7 and all of its capabilities, or something like that. Applied in the Jewish-Christian relationship, supersessionism is the really old argument by Christians. The long-standing Christian argument that with the ministry of Jesus, and particularly the rejection of his messiahship by the first century Jews, most of them at least, that God moved his blessings from ancient Israel, the Israel of the Old Testament, to this community of the church. And so the church superseded ancient Israel and became the main focus of God's blessings and his work in the world. And so This idea then translated onto Jewish-Christian relations meant that Christians saw Jews as discarded people of God that were somehow cursed, that the curse of wandering and not having land, not having a nation, was part of the supersession of Israel, of ancient Israel, by the church. And oftentimes then, and you'll see this all throughout church literature and even the liturgy, the church assumes the name of Israel, sometimes the new Israel. And so this is the doctrine of supersessionism, and it's seen now by theologians and historians to be one of the major justifications by Christians to sort of mistreat Jews. And that sits at the background of the role of Jews in prophecy. In one way, because many of the Christians who looked to Jews as sort of fulfilling some sort of prophetic role either rejected supersessionism or incorporated it in the sense that the Jews returning to their land was part of solving supersessionism, was part of reintegrating Israel, and by that, by the Jewish people, into the story of God. And that often included the idea that Jews would be converted to Christianity as part of the process of returning to their land in the Middle East. There's an important distinction to be made between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism is this long-standing anti-Jewish feeling, particularly among Christians, largely on religious grounds, though they could bleed into sort of anti-Jewish culture and other things as well. But that's to be distinguished from the much more modern phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which is really based in 19th and 20th century concepts of race. And one of the distinctions to make here is to not read all of Jewish Christian history through the lens of 20th century anti-Semitism. That can sort of distort our understanding of what was dividing the communities, and particularly what Christians were thinking about before the modern era. And this is something that Nirenberg goes into in great detail. And one reason he finds anti-Judaism a much more compelling framework is because you can sort of fold anti-Semitism into anti-Judaism, but you can't sort of do the opposite. Anti-Semitism has so many assumptions that are modern in a sense about race and other concepts that anti-Judaism doesn't necessarily have, though it can. And finally, while supersessionism really did dominate most of Christian thinking in terms of Jewish-Christian relations up through the 20th century, post-Holocaust theology by Christians thinking about Jewish-Christian relations after the 1940s, has really tried to reverse that trend. What I want to argue to you is that post-Holocaust theology has actually branched in two directions. One of them, and probably the more well-known direction, is one not covered by anything in Boyer, by Catholic and more liberal Protestant theologians that have sought to get rid of any of the supersessionist language in previous Christian theology, and any of the desire by Christians to try to convert Jews or to treat Jews as the discarded people of God, but to see them as sort of fellow believers in God. Maybe the Judeo-Christian tradition concept can help here. And this type of post-Holocaust theology has been very successful, very popular. The changes in the Catholic Church enacted in Vatican II in the 1960s are a direct product of this post-Holocaust thinking, where the Catholic Church removed the charge of deicide, or the killing of God, from its teachings about the Jews, and it also explicitly condemned anti-Semitism, which it had not done up until that point. This type of post-Holocaust theology has gotten a lot of attention. What I argue is you can also see the prophecy literature as also being, in many ways, a post-Holocaust phenomenon. At least the prophecy literature coming out after the 1940s often has a very explicit reference to the Holocaust and a claim, particularly by evangelical Christians, that in light of the Christian complicity in the Holocaust, in light of the fact that many of the Nazis who were carrying out the Holocaust were also confessing Christians, were also Lutherans who went to church on Sunday, that the response by Christians today is to support the state of Israel, and that the state of Israel is this necessary safe place for Jews in a post-Holocaust world, and that the Christian obligation now is to make sure that Israel is secure and safe, and also that God will be working through the state of Israel to enact his judgment on the world. And I think it's pretty clear that a lot of the prophecy literature, though it may have the same sort of system as 19th century and early 20th century prophecy theologians, is framed in a post-Holocaust setting. So with these terms in mind, I wanted to just show you one set of images to give you a sense of particularly the enduring Christian view of Judaism that animates a lot of Boyer's background material on this. On the left side, you'll see two statues. These are from the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. You'll see two women depicted, and these are on almost any medieval cathedral that have these two women. The one on the left is called Synagoga, and the one on the right is called Ecclesia. And these are representations of Judaism on the left, synagogue, Judaism, and on the right, the church, or ecclesia, the ecclesiastical structure of the church. You'll see on the left that Synagoga is downtrodden. She's blinded. She has something over her eyes. She is holding in her right hand the law, but it's slipping from her fingers, and she looks defeated. And on the right, Ecclesia is triumphant. She has a crown on. She is looking down over the earth, and she is victorious. And this is a very visual representation of that supersessionist understanding of the Christian church. And as I mentioned, can be seen in virtually any European, in particular, cathedral. And finally, on the far right, you see a propaganda poster from Poland in 1943 at the really height of the Holocaust in occupied Poland. And you see the anti-Semitic depiction of a Jew as complicit and as the killer of Jesus on the cross. And this is a weaponized, anti-Semitic version of this very old Christian trope. So with those images and these keywords in your mind, I'll turn to my last section talking about the modern movement by evangelicals, particularly the ones who believe in the type of prophecy scenarios that you're looking at in When Time Shall Be No More, and how they relate to Jews and to the modern state of Israel. So what I want to talk about for these final few minutes is the growth of Christian Zionism in the current moment, in the sort of 1990s through the present, and give you a sense of what has happened since, Boyer's book came out and how we can understand prophecy in the current relationship between Christians, evangelical Christians in particular, and Jews. So here are two pictures of what we might call the modern Christian Zionist movement. The one on the top right is from Jerusalem just a few years ago, one of the many large international marches by Christians in support of Israel. This one is part of a yearly, what's called a Feast of Tabernacles celebration, where Christians descend on Jerusalem, about 5,000 of them or 6,000 of them every year, to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, but with a Christian spin, and they call it the Feast of Tabernacles. And they have a final rally every year where they march through the streets of Jerusalem in support of Israel. And on the bottom left is by far the most important American evangelical supporter of Israel, a man by the name of John Hagee, a pastor from San Antonio, Texas, a strong supporter of Donald Trump, and the founder and director of the organization Christians United for Israel, which I mentioned earlier by showing their emblem. Here's their leader. And Christians United for Israel was founded in 2006 and was really the first national evangelical pro-Israel organization that was focused solely on the issue of supporting Israel. And John Hagee sort of represents the leadership of the American evangelical part of the Christian Zionist world, and the marches in Jerusalem represent really a global movement that spans all 5, 6 continents, from Brazil to Nigeria to South Korea to Israel, where many of the global Christian Zionist organizations are headquartered in Jerusalem. And these are sort of the two branches of the current movement. And they both have a lot of diversity within them, and it would be hard to generalize about what all Christian Zionists say or think about Israel, except that they tend to support Israel, and there tends to be an element of prophecy belief in that support. But what I want to tell you about is another part of that shared Christian Zionist understanding that has to do specifically with Israel and the Jewish people. And what I'm going to say is what unites all of these people, who have all different types of prophecy scenarios. Boyer outlines sort of the predominant American understanding of the rapture and the Antichrist and the Battle of Armageddon. Though that particular scenario isn't shared by many of the people that would have been marching in Jerusalem in 2015 in Sacre Park. But what is shared among all of them is a sort of fixation on Israel as the center of God's activity on earth, and as Israel as sort of the mediator between God and the rest of humanity in dispensing blessings and curses. It's the barometer for these Christians of how each of us will be judged in the afterlife, and even in our lives today, and how each nation will be judged, has to do with how they treat Israel. And that understanding is derived largely from a particular reading of a verse in the Bible, Genesis 12:3, where God is speaking to Abram. This is at the very beginning of the story of the Bible, and God is making his covenant with Abram that will sort of set up a lot of the rest of the Old Testament story. And God says, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." And this is the understanding. If you read this and you take it quite literally, and you understand that the "you" in this verse is referring to Abram and then Abraham and all of his descendants, which you translate into the Jewish people and the state of Israel, then you get this understanding of the way God is going to interact with humanity. That God basically looks at every peoples on earth and sees how they bless or curse the Israeli or the nation of Israel. And just to hit this home, this is a passage from John Hagee's Prophecy Study Bible. There's a lot of words on the screen, but if you look at the second highlighted area, the yellow area, this is Hagee explaining this verse. This is sort of his annotation of this verse. And he talks about the universal aspects of the covenant are threefold. Blessings for those people and nations which bless Abraham and the nation which comes from him. Cursings upon those people and nations who curse Abraham and Israel. And then 3, blessings upon all the families of the earth through the Messiah, who according to the flesh is Abraham's son and provides salvation for the entire world. That should give you a sense of how this understanding of God's relationship to Israel, the state of Israel today, and the Jewish people operates for many of these Christians. And so what I want to argue is this is broadly under sort of considering prophecy and considering the future, that this type of teaching is being put forward, but it's also something that can be detached from any particular prophetic scenario. And in fact, it's a way of understanding sort of a transactional relationship between God and between humanity. And this, as much as any particular prophecy scenario, is what today unites the Christian Zionist world, and is one really prominent and tangible way that prophecy belief has political implications. And so when Boyer was writing in the mid-90s, this type of reading of particularly Genesis 12 was around, but it was not nearly as prominent, and it was not a bridge between the American Christian world and the global Christian world, at least those parts of it that were interested in supporting Israel. So this is one of the major, you could say, if Boyer were still around and he wanted to write an updated version of When Time Shall Be No More, he'd have to grapple more with this type of understanding and this type of thinking. And in part that's because the Christians who have become most prominent in interpreting prophecy and in using it as a core part of their Christian teaching has developed more and more toward a what you might think of as a Pentecostal or charismatic type of evangelical Christianity, one that often teaches a personal prosperity gospel. John Hagee started his career and still teaches a prosperity gospel that God really does want to bless each and every one of us materially, with good health, and with successful nations, and particularly for him, sort of a pro-America understanding of that. And it's no accident that these prosperity preachers also tend to emphasize the transactional relationship of something like this verse that seems to give a key or an understanding to how God will bless entire peoples just by blessing Israel. And so you can see the strands of what Boyer calls philo-Semitism, what is a sort of fixation on the Jewish people, a sense that they will always be set apart, and that Israel in particular is this key conduit between humanity and God. This all continues and is in the same continuity of what Boyer is talking about. So there's a little dip into the way that particularly evangelical Christians have thought about the Jewish people in relation to prophecy, and how even today this type of thinking, though taking on a different form, is quite important for really millions of evangelicals, not just in the United States, but around the world. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and enjoy the rest of your class.